You can all imagine the scene. 5-year-old Madeline climbed onto her father's lap. "Did you have enough to eat?" he asked her. She smiled and patted her tummy. "Can't eat any more." "Did you have some of Grandma's pudding?" "A whole piece?" And Joe looked across the table at his mum. "Looks like you filled us up. Don't think we're going to be able to do anything else tonight but go to bed." And Madeline put her little hands on either side of his big face. "Oh, but Daddy, this is Christmas Eve. You said we could dance." And Joe feigned a poor memory. "Did I now? Why, I don't remember saying anything about dancing." Well, Grandma smiled and she shook her head and she began to clear the table. "But Daddy," Madeline pleaded, "we always dance on Christmas Eve. Just you and me, remember?" A smile burst from beneath his thick mustache. "Of course I remember, darling. How could I forget?" And with that, he stood and took her by her little hand. And for a moment, just for a moment, his wife was alive again. And the two were walking into the living room another night before Christmas, as they had spent so many dancing away the evening. They would have danced the rest of their lives, but then came the surprise pregnancy and the complications. Madeline survived, but her mother did not. And Joe, the thick-handed butcher, was left to raise his Madeline alone. "Come on, Daddy," she tugged on his hand. "Let's dance before everyone arrives." And she was right. Soon the doorbell would ring and the relatives would fill the floor and the night would be passed. But for now, it was just Daddy and Madeline. You've got to admit it, that the love of a parent is one mighty force. Just think for a moment about a newborn baby. It offers the parents very little. No money, no words of wisdom, nothing but dirty nappies and sleepless nights. And yet there is no shortage of love on the parent's part. Just look at the mum's eyes as she nurses it, or the dad's face as he cradles it. In fact, Jesus once said that if we human beings who are sinful know how to love and to give good things, then how much more the perfect Heavenly Father? Well, that may all be well and good while the child is an infant, but what happens when they grow older and the love given is not returned? What happens to a father's heart whose child turns away? For that is what happened to Joe. In fact, rebellion flew into Joe's world like a whirlwind. About the time she was old enough to drive, Madeline decided she was old enough to lead her own life. And that life did not include her father. "I should have seen it coming," Joe would later say. "But for the life of me, I didn't." He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to handle the pierced nose and the tight skirts. He didn't understand the late nights and the poor grades. And most of all, he didn't know when to speak and when to be quiet. She, on the other hand, had got it all worked out. She knew when to speak to her father, never. She knew when to be quiet, always. The pattern, however, was reversed with a lanky, tattooed kid from down the street. He was no good, and Joe knew it. And there was no way he was going to allow his daughter to spend Christmas Eve with him. "You'll be in tonight, young lady. You'll be at your grandma's house eating your grandma's pudding. You've got to be with ours on Christmas Eve." Well, though they were at the same table, they might well have been in different planets. Madeline played with her food and said nothing. Grandma, well, she tried to talk to Joe, but he was in no mood to chat. Part of him was angry. and part of him was heartbroken. And the rest of him would have given anything to know how to talk to this girl who once sat on his lap. Well, soon the relatives arrived, bringing with them a welcome end to the awkward silence. And as the room filled with noise and people, Joe stayed on one side and Madeline sullenly sat on the other. "Put on the music, Joe," reminded one of his brothers. And so he did. And thinking that she would be honored, he turned and walked towards his daughter. "Will you dance with your dad tonight?" The way she huffed and turned, you'd have thought he'd slapped her in the face. In full view of the whole family, she walked through the front door, marched down the street, leaving her father alone, very alone. Now, the thing is, the Bible tells us and experience confirms that that actually is the way we have behaved towards God, the perfect Father, the one who made us and who would lovingly care for us. The prophet Isaiah describes our behavior using a picture of wandering sheep. He says, "We're all like sheep who have gone astray. We've wandered each one to his own way." And it's a willful, deliberate turning that we've done, like rebellious teenager. And it's a dangerous turning away, leading to estrangement from God and all that is good. And if we continue like that, says the Bible, wandering into a cold, dark eternity. So the Bible is very clear that is our situation and that is how serious it is. The question is this: how does God react when we treat him like that? Well, let's go back to our story. Madeline came back that night, but not for long. Joe never faulted her for leaving. After all, what's it like being a daughter of a butcher? In their last days together, he tried so hard. He made her favorite dinner she didn't want to eat. He invited her to a film. She stayed in her room. He bought her a new dress, and she didn't even say thank you. And then there was the spring day he left work early to be at the house when she arrived home from school. And what do you know, that was the day she never came home. A friend saw her and a boyfriend in the vicinity of the bus station. The authorities later confirmed that they'd purchased a ticket in order to go to London. Where she went from there, well, that was anybody's guess. You see, God the Father's heart, like Joe's heart, may be broken by our plight, by our treatment of him. But it's still a heart full of passion. We may be lost, but God is the one who sets about doing the finding. Because that, actually, when you think about it, is what the meaning of Christmas is all about. Is the account of the greatest rescue mission ever mounted. You see, wrapped up in human nerve tissue and muscle and flesh, the one who created breath discovered in his own experience what it was like to draw breath as he emerged from the virgin's womb onto straw. Only to be surrounded not by angels, but by animals. The Son of God became a human being so that human beings may become children of God. God entered into our mess to clean us up. And what a mess we've made, as we see in our story. You see, the scrawny boy with the tattoos had a cousin. And the cousin worked the night shift at a convenience store. And for a few pounds a month, he would let the runaways stay in his room at night. But they had to be out during the day. And that was fine for them. They'd got big plans. He was going to be a mechanic, and, well, Madeline just knew she could get a job at a department store. Now, of course, he knew nothing about cars, and she knew even less about getting a job. But you don't think of things like that when you're intoxicated with freedom. Well, after a couple of weeks, the cousin changed his mind. And the day he announced his decision, the boyfriend announced his. And Madeline found herself facing the night with no place to sleep and no hand to hold. And it was the first of many such nights. Well, a woman in the park told her about a homeless shelter near the bridge. For a few pounds, you could get a bowl of soup, you could get a room. Well, she used a backpack as a pillow, and she used a jacket as a blanket. But the room was really rowdy, and it was very difficult to sleep. So Madeline turned her face to the wall, and for the first time in several days, thought of the whiskered face of her father as he would kiss her goodnight. But as her eyes began to water, she refused to cry. She pushed the memory deep inside and determined not to think about home. She'd gone too far to go back. Well, the next morning, the girl in the bed beside her showed her a fistful of tips she'd made from dancing on tables. "This is the last night I'll have to stay here," she said. "Now I can pay for my own place. They told me they're looking for another girl. Perhaps you should come by." And she reached into her pocket and she pulled out a matchbook. Here's the address. Madeline's stomach turned at the thought. All she could do was mumble, "Well, I'll think about it." She spent the rest of the week on the streets looking for work. At the end of the week, when it was time to pay her bill at the shelter, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the matchbook. That's all she had left. "I won't be staying here tonight," she said, and she walked through the door. You see, hunger has a way of softening our convictions. You see, at the end of the day, our problems come down to pride and shame. And you'll never guess that they are twin sisters, since they appear so different. Pride puffs out her chest. Shame hangs her head. Pride boasts, shame hides. Both have the same parent and both have the same effect, to keep you away from the Father. Pride exclaims, "I'm too good for him." Shame whimpers, "I'm too bad for him." Pride drives you away and shame keeps you away. And you know, that is why God seems so remote and so far away to so many people. Maybe you here tonight. In our pride, we think we can run our own lives without him. In our shame, we look at the mess we've made and we dare not come near him. So what can be done? Well, let me tell you what happened to Madeline. If Madeline knew anything, she knew how to dance. Her father had taught her from the age of 5. Now, men the age of her father watched her. She didn't rationalize it. She didn't think about it. Madeline simply did her work and she took their money. She might not have thought about it except for the letters. The cousin brought them. Not one, not two, but a box full, all addressed to her and all from her father. "Your boyfriend must have squealed on you," he said. "These come 2 or 3 a week," complained the cousin. "Give him your address." But she couldn't. He might find her. Nor could she bear to open the envelopes. She knew what they said. He wanted her home. But if he knew what she was doing, then he wouldn't want her home, she thought. It seemed less painful not even reading them. So she didn't. Not that week. Not the week after. Not the next when the cousin brought more. She kept them in the dressing room at the club, organized according to the postmark. And she ran her finger over the top of each, but she couldn't bring herself to open one. Now, most days, Madeline was able to numb the emotions. Thoughts of home and thoughts of shame were shoved into the same part of her heart. And there were occasions when the thoughts were too strong to resist, nevertheless. Like the time when she saw a dress in the clothing store window. In fact, it was a dress the same color as the one her father had purchased for her. It was a dress that had been far too plain for her. And with much reluctance, she'd put it on and she stood with her father before the mirror. "My, how tall you are," he said. "You're almost as tall as I am." And she stiffened at his touch. Well, seeing her weary face reflected back in the store window, Madeline realized that she'd give 1,000 dresses just to feel the touch of his arm once again. And she left that store resolved never to pass by again. Well, in time, the leaves fell, the air chilled. The post came, and the cousin complained, and the stacks of letters, they grew. Still, she refused to send him an address, and she refused to read a letter. Then a few days before Christmas Eve, another letter arrived. Same shape, same color, but no postmark. And it was not delivered by the cousin who was sitting there in a dressing room. A couple of days ago, a big man, stopped by and asked me to give you this, explained one of the other dancers. Said you'd understand the message. "He was here?" she said anxiously. The woman shrugged. "I suppose he was." Madeline swallowed hard, and she looked at the envelope. She opened it, and she removed the card. "I know where you are," it read, "and I know what you do. But that doesn't change the way I feel about you. What I've said in each of the letter is true." "But I don't know what you've said," said Madeline. And she pulled the letter from the top of the stack and she read it. And then a second, and then a third. And each letter had the same sentence. Each sentence asked the same question. And in a matter of moments, the floor was littered with paper and her face was streaked with tears. Within an hour, she was on the bus. "I just might make it in time." She barely did. The relatives were starting to leave, and Joe was helping Grandma in the kitchen when his brother called from the hallway. "Joe, someone to see you." And Joe stepped out of the kitchen, and he stopped. In one hand, the girl held a backpack. In the other, she held a card. And Joe saw the question in her eyes. "The answer is yes," she said to her father. "If the invitation still stands, the answer is yes." Joe swallowed hard. "Oh my, yeah, the invitation still stands." And so the two danced again on Christmas Eve. And on the floor near the door rested a letter with Madeline's name and her father's request. "Will you come home and dance with your daddy again?" So how do we come home to God? Well, in many ways, we see it in our story, the father and the daughter. The father never ceased loving his daughter, which father can? And that's why he wrote to her letter after letter, until eventually he went down to her place of shame to seek her out. The invitation he extended to her was for her shame to be covered, her pride to be abandoned, so that once more she may be back home where she belonged, dancing with delight in her father's arms. Now, do you not think that such love cost the father? The endless nights of anxiety and worry, the hurt of rejection, the spurning of his kindness, the embarrassment of what she was doing. You see, real forgiveness, like real reconciliation, always costs. The pain of sin has to be absorbed by someone. Here it was the Father. And so it is with us and God, friends. You see, Jesus told a story very similar to this, but of an estranged son. It was known as the prodigal son. This is really the prodigal daughter. And in that story, Jesus told there was no doubt who the Father represents. He represents God. And who the Son represents, namely us. But 2,000 years ago now, their story became a reality as the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. When He, God, came in the person of Jesus Christ, He too was rejected. He too had his heart broken. His own did not receive Him. But the price for all our sin and rejection of God was going to be borne personally by God Himself. As the one who was laid there in the crib as a baby was to grow into a man and go to a cross to bear your punishment and mine. And proof that the way back home is now open was that He was raised from the dead. So as John put it in that reading we had a few moments ago, whoever receives Him, whoever believes in Him, He gave the right to become children of God. And tonight might be the night when God is calling you home to enjoy what the writer C.S. Lewis calls the great dance. Because knowing God in Jesus is not a drudge, it is a delight. And it's what we were made for, like a child with a parent, like a bride with her groom. And the Father's invitation is still open. So why not accept it tonight? As we now bow our heads for a short prayer. Let's bow our heads as we pray. Most gracious God, you have sent invitation after invitation through the prophets and apostles in the Bible, calling us to return home to you. Thank you for sending Jesus, born as a baby to live perfectly as a man and to die on a cross for the way I have badly treated you and others. Tonight, please forgive me. Please accept me because of what your Son did for me. And make me your child so that I might serve and live with you forever, the perfect Father. Amen.